Man alone was feared by every man in town, until the native girl smiled at him from the trading post. The silence that followed him into every saloon wasn't the kind that came from respect. It was the silence of fear, thick as smoke and twice as suffocating. Men would glance up from their cards, their hands instinctively moving toward their guns before remembering who they were looking at. Then they'd look away, fast. But that was before she smiled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory in the summer of 1873. The heat was already building, promising another scorching day that would drive most folks indoors by noon. But not him. He never seemed bothered by heat, cold, or much of anything else that troubled ordinary men. Thomas Brennan rode into town on a horse as black as his reputation, his weathered duster coat hanging loose over broad shoulders that had carried more burdens than most men twice his age. At 30, his face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises and seeing too much of what men could do to each other. His hands, calloused and scarred, rested easy on the reins, but everyone who saw them knew they could move to his colt faster than a striking rattler. The stories followed him like tumbleweeds in a dust devil. They said he'd killed 12 men in fair fights and twice that many in fights that weren't so fair. They said he'd been a marshal once, before something happened in Tombstone that no one talked about above a whisper. They said he'd lost everything that mattered to him and decided that nothing would ever matter again. What they didn't say, because they didn't know, was that Thomas Brennan was tired. Bone deep, soul deep tired of being the man everyone feared. Tired of the weight of his guns, tired of the careful distance people kept, tired of sleeping with one eye open and his hand on his weapon. But tired as he was, he couldn't see a way out. When you've made yourself into something feared, it's not easy to become something else. He dismounted outside Morrison's trading post, a sturdy building that served as the town's general store, post office, and unofficial gathering place for news and gossip. The morning crowd was already there, ranchers and townspeople conducting the day's business, but the usual chatter died as his boots hit the wooden porch with deliberate steps. Inside, the familiar dance began. People found urgent business elsewhere in the store, moving away from wherever he happened to be. The clerk, a nervous man named Peterson, served him with shaking hands and wouldn't meet his eyes. Thomas bought what he needed, ammunition and tobacco, paying with exact change and speaking only when necessary. That's when he saw her. She stood behind the counter in the corner section where Morrison kept items specifically for the Apache reservation nearby. Traditional goods and supplies that the government agents either wouldn't or couldn't provide. Her skin was the warm bronze of desert clay, her long black hair braided with small beads that caught the light filtering through the dusty windows. She wore a simple blue dress that looked store-bought but had been altered with traditional beadwork along the sleeves and hem. Most striking of all, when their eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small lifting of the corners of her mouth, but it hit Thomas Brennan harder than any bullet ever had. And that smile was something he'd forgotten existed, something he thought he'd lost forever in the blood and dust of too many violent years. It was kindness, offered freely and without judgment. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that made the simple words sound like music. Thomas stood there, suddenly aware that he was staring, suddenly aware that the entire store had gone completely silent. He touched the brim of his hat, the gesture feeling rusty from disuse. "Morning, miss." "Ayanna," she said. "Ayanna Yazzie." Thomas Brennan. If his name meant anything to her, she didn't show it. She continued sorting through a shipment of blankets, her movements graceful and unhurried. Other customers gave them both a wide berth, but she seemed unaware of the tension radiating through the store. "You are new to Copper Ridge," she said. It wasn't a question, just passing through. Most men say that. Few actually leave. There was something in her tone, not quite teasing but not entirely serious either, that made Thomas want to smile. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like he was just another person instead of a walking threat. Maybe this town has more to offer than most, he found himself saying. Her smile widened slightly. Perhaps it does. Before Thomas could figure out what to say next, the moment was broken by the arrival of Deputy Marshal Hayes, a young man whose badge looked too big on his narrow chest. Hayes had clearly been working up the courage to approach, and when he finally did, his voice cracked slightly. "Brennan, Sheriff wants to see you." Thomas nodded, touching his hat brim toward Ayanna again. "Miss Yazzie." "Mr. Brennan," she replied, and there was something in the way she said his name that made him want to turn back around. But he followed Hayes out into the blazing Arizona sun, acutely aware that something had just changed in his carefully controlled world. Sheriff Marcus Coltrane was a man who'd earned his position through competence rather than politics, a rarity in territorial law enforcement. His office was sparse but clean, dominated by a large desk covered with wanted posters and territorial correspondence. He looked up when Thomas entered, his gray eyes assessing but not hostile. "Brennan, heard you rode in this morning." News travels fast in small towns. Faster when it involves men with your reputation. Coltrane leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to be straight with you. This is a peaceful town, and I aim to keep it that way." Thomas remained standing, his hands relaxed at his sides. "I've got no quarrel with anyone here, Sheriff. Glad to hear it. But trouble has a way of finding men like you, whether you're looking for it or not. I'm just passing through." "So I've heard. Question is, when?" It was a fair question, and Thomas realized he didn't have a fair answer. He'd been drifting for 3 years now, moving from town to town with no particular destination in mind. But something about Copper Ridge felt different. Or maybe it was the girl with the kind eyes who'd smiled at him like he was worth smiling at. Few days, maybe a week. Depends on how long my business takes. What business would that be? Thomas had learned long ago that the best lies contained as much truth as possible. Looking for work. Heard there might be opportunities in the territory. Coltrane studied him for a long moment. There's always work for a man willing to use his guns. Question is what kind of work you're looking for. The legal kind, Sheriff. See that it stays that way. Coltrane stood, indicating the conversation was over. You'll be staying at the hotel? That was the plan. Mrs. Chun runs a clean establishment. She doesn't tolerate trouble any more than I do. Thomas nodded and turned to leave, but Coltrane's voice stopped him at the door. "Brennan, that girl at the trading post. Ayanna Yazzie. She's under the protection of both the territorial government and the Apache Nation. Just thought you should know." Thomas looked back, meeting the sheriff's steady gaze. "Why would I need to know that?" Because men with reputations like yours tend to attract attention from other men with similar reputations. And Miss Yazzie has already attracted more attention than any young woman should have to handle." The warning was clear, and Thomas appreciated the sheriff's directness. But it also raised questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. The Copper Ridge Hotel was indeed clean and well-maintained, a 2-story building with a small restaurant on the ground floor. Mrs. Chun, a small Chinese woman with steel in her spine, looked him over with sharp eyes before agreeing to rent him a room. Her English was accented but precise. $3 a week, meals extra. No drinking in rooms, no fighting, no women of ill repute. You break something, you pay for it. You cause trouble, you leave. Understood? Understood? She handed him a key. Room 12, 2nd floor, faces the street. Bathhouse is out back, open until 10 o'clock. Thomas climbed the narrow stairs to his room, a simple space with a bed, washstand, and single chair positioned by the window. The window looked out over the main street, and from it he could see the trading post where Ayanna Yazzie was probably still sorting blankets and smiling at customers who deserved her kindness more than he did. He'd been in the room less than an hour when he heard the commotion outside. 3 riders had stopped in front of the trading post, and even from a distance, Thomas could tell they weren't local ranchers or traveling merchants. They sat their horses with the loose confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted, and their clothes and gear spoke of money earned through questionable means. The leader was a tall man with pale hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Thomas didn't recognize him, but he recognized the type. Predator. The kind of man who saw anything beautiful or peaceful as something to be taken or destroyed. Through the window, Thomas watched the three men dismount and enter the trading post. A few minutes later, several customers came out quickly, their business apparently concluded with unusual haste. Thomas was reaching for his gun belt before he realized he'd made a decision. The trading post was unnaturally quiet when he entered. Peterson, the nervous clerk, was nowhere to be seen. Morrison himself, the owner, stood behind the main counter with the rigid posture of a man trying very hard to appear calm. And near the back of the store, by the section where Ayanna worked, the three strangers had her cornered. "Now don't be unfriendly, darling," the leader was saying, his voice carrying the false charm of a snake oil salesman. "We're just asking for directions." "I have given you directions to the reservation," Ayanna replied, her voice steady, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. "The agent there can help you with whatever business you have." "Our business isn't with the agent," said the second man, shorter and darker than his leader, but with the same predatory gleam in his eyes. "Our business is with certain individuals who might be hiding there." "No one is hiding on the reservation." "You seem mighty sure about that," the leader said, stepping closer. "Makes a man wonder what you might know that you're not sharing." Thomas moved deeper into the store, his boots silent on the wooden floor. The three men were focused entirely on Ayanna and hadn't noticed him yet. "The Apache Nation honors its treaties," Ayanna said, taking a small step back but maintaining her dignity. "We harbor no fugitives." "Treaties," the third man spat. He was the youngest of the three, probably not much older than Ayanna herself, but there was already a cruelty in his face that spoke of a soul gone rotten early. "Your people break treaties whenever it suits them. Perhaps you should be more concerned with how often your people break them." Ayanna replied, and Thomas had to admire her courage even as he worried about her safety. The leader's false smile disappeared. "Now that sounds like fighting talk, girl. Might be you need to learn some manners." He reached toward her, and that's when Thomas spoke. "Might be you need to learn some yourself." All three men spun toward him, hands dropping toward their weapons but stopping when they saw who they were facing. Recognition dawned slowly, starting with the leader and spreading to his companions like ripples in a dark pond. "Well, well," the leader said, his hand moving carefully away from his gun. "Thomas Brennan. Heard you were still alive." "Heard the same about you, Pike, though I can't say I'm pleased about it." "Jake Pike." Thomas should have recognized him sooner. They'd crossed paths twice before, both times ending with Pike riding away from dead friends and empty hands. Pike was smart enough to avoid fair fights and vicious enough to win unfair ones, which made him dangerous in a different way than men who relied purely on speed and accuracy. "Now don't be unfriendly, Tom. We're just having a conversation with the young lady here." "Conversation's over." Thomas hadn't moved from where he stood, but something in his posture made Pike's companions shift nervously. "Time for you to ride out." "We just got here," Pike said, but his tone had changed. The predatory confidence was still there, but it was tempered now with calculation. Pike was wondering if Thomas was still as fast as the stories claimed and whether he was willing to find out. "Then you won't have far to go." For a moment, the tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Thomas could see Pike weighing his options, measuring the odds, trying to decide if whatever business had brought him to Copper Ridge was worth the risk of facing Thomas Brennan. Finally, Pike smiled his cold smile and touched his hat brim. "Another time, perhaps." "Miss Yazzie, it's been a pleasure." He gestured to his men, and they began moving toward the door, but Pike paused next to Thomas. "Interesting company you're keeping these days, Tom. Didn't figure you for the type to take up with Indians." Thomas met his gaze steadily. Didn't figure you for the type to run from a fight, Jake. Times change, I guess. Pike's smile tightened, but he continued toward the door. Yes, they do. See you around, Tom. After they left, the store remained quiet for several long moments. Morrison emerged from behind his counter, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, and Peterson appeared from wherever he'd been hiding. But Thomas's attention was entirely on Ayanna, who stood exactly where she'd been during the confrontation, composed and dignified despite what had just happened. You all right? He asked. I am fine, thank you. She smoothed her dress and began reorganizing the blankets that had been disturbed. That was unnecessary. Thomas blinked. Unnecessary? I was handling the situation. They were 3 armed men who'd cornered you in the back of the store. How exactly were you handling it? For the first time since he'd met her, Ayanna looked directly at him with something other than kindness in her eyes. By being patient and polite until they grew bored and left. By not escalating a tense situation into a potentially deadly one. By remembering that I have to live in this town long after visiting gunfighters move on to wherever they move on to. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Thomas realized that in his eagerness to protect her, he might have made things worse for her in the long run. Men like Pike had long memories and shorter tempers. You're right, he said. I apologize. His quick agreement seemed to surprise her. You apologize? Pike and his boys will remember this. They might come back, and when they do, it'll be partly because of what I just did. Ayanna studied his face for a moment, and some of the frost in her manner began to thaw. Perhaps. But it is also true that they might have grown bolder if no one had stood up to them. Still, I should have thought before I acted, and I should have thanked you before I criticized you. She smiled, and Thomas felt that same warm impact he'd experienced that morning. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Whatever the consequences, your intentions were honorable. They looked at each other across the store, and Thomas felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't just attraction, though he couldn't deny that was part of it. It was recognition of some kind, as if each saw something in the other that they'd been missing. Would you like to walk with me? The words came out before Thomas realized he was going to say them. Walk with you where? Nowhere in particular. Just walk. Ayanna considered this. People will talk. Let them. They will say things about both of us that are not true. Do you care what they say? She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Do you? Thomas realized that for the first time in years, he didn't. Let the people of Copper Ridge gossip and speculate. Let them whisper about the feared gunfighter and the Apache girl. He was tired of living his life according to what other people expected or feared. No, he said, I don't. Then I would like to walk with you, Thomas Brennan. They left the trading post together, stepping out into the afternoon heat that was beginning to build toward its daily crescendo. Ayanna led them away from the main street, along a path that wound between scattered houses toward the edge of town, where the desert began to reclaim the land from human ambition. You have been in many places, she said as they walked. Too many. What do you see when you look at them? The places you have been? Thomas considered the question. Mostly I see what's the same. Every town has a saloon, a sheriff, men who think their problems can be solved with violence. The details change, but the pattern stays the same. That is a sad way to see the world. Maybe, but it's an accurate way. Is it, or is it simply the only way you have learned to see? They walked in comfortable silence for a while, leaving the last houses behind and entering the vast openness that surrounded Copper Ridge on all sides. The desert stretched away toward distant mountains, the landscape painted in shades of gold and red and purple that seemed to shift with the movement of clouds across the sun. This is where I come to think, Ayanna said, settling onto a flat rock that provided a natural seat overlooking the valley. When the trading post becomes too full of people and their fears. Thomas remained standing, scanning the horizon automatically as he'd learned to do in any open space. Their fears? Of change. of anything different from what they have always known, of people like me who remind them that this land was not always theirs. Does that bother you, living among people who fear you?" Ayanna laughed, a sound like water flowing over stones. "Do you not do the same thing, Thomas Brennan?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd never thought of it that way, but she was right. He'd been living among people who feared him for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything else. "I suppose I do," he said quietly. "The difference is that you chose your fear. You made yourself into something to be afraid of. I was born into mine." Thomas sat down beside her on the rock, close enough to catch the faint scent of sage and something else, something uniquely her. "Why do you stay?" "In town, you could live on the reservation with your own people. Some of my people live in town, and some of the white people are not afraid. Mrs. Chun treats me fairly. Sheriff Coltrane judges me by my actions, not my blood. Even Morrison, for all his nervousness, has never cheated me or refused my business." "And the others?" "The others are learning, slowly, but they are learning. Change comes like the seasons, Thomas. You cannot force it, but you can prepare for it and welcome it when it arrives." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon heat began to ease toward evening. Thomas found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years, the constant tension that kept his muscles coiled and his senses alert beginning to unwind. "What about you?" Ayanna asked. "What made you choose to become something to be feared?" Thomas was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I had a family once, a wife, a daughter. We lived in a little town outside Tombstone, and I was the marshal there. Thought I was making the world a little safer, a little better." He paused, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "There was a gang that had been terrorizing the territory. The Hutchins gang. They hit banks, stages, murdered anyone who got in their way. I tracked them for months, finally cornered them in the hills outside town." Ayanna waited, sensing that he needed to tell the story in his own way at his own pace. "I should have waited for help, should have sent for more deputies. But I was young and proud and sure of myself. I thought I could handle them alone." Another pause. In the distance, a hawk circled on the thermal currents rising from the heated desert floor. "They got away, all of them. And while I was chasing shadows in the hills, they doubled back and hit the town. They robbed the bank, burned half the main street, and—" his voice broke slightly. "They killed everyone who tried to stop them, including my wife and daughter." Ayanna felt tears sting her eyes, but she remained silent. "After that, I stopped caring about being fair or legal or honorable. I tracked them down one by one, and I killed them all. But killing them didn't bring back Mary and little Beth, didn't undo my failure. So I kept going, kept becoming more and more the kind of man who could do what needed to be done, no matter how dark it got. And now?" Thomas looked at her, this woman who had somehow seen past his reputation to something worth smiling at. "Now I'm tired. Tired of being that man, tired of carrying all that death, tired of being alone with it." Ayanna reached out and covered his clenched fist with her small, brown hand. "You are not alone now." The simple touch, the simple words, threatened to undo him completely. When was the last time someone had offered him comfort instead of fear or challenge or false bravado? "You don't know what you're saying," he said roughly. "You don't know what I've done, what I'm capable of. I know what you did today. I know that you stood up for someone who needed standing up for. I know that you are capable of kindness as well as violence. That's not enough to balance the scales. Perhaps not. But it is a beginning." As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Pike was still out there, still a threat to Ayanna and the people of Copper Ridge. But for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Brennan had found something worth protecting that had nothing to do with revenge or duty or the ghosts of his past. He had found something worth living for. That night, Alone in his hotel room, Thomas cleaned his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. Pike would be back. Men like him always came back. And when he did, Thomas would be ready. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting for the dead. He'd be fighting for the living, for the possibility of a future that included quiet conversations under desert skies and the smile of a woman who'd seen something in him worth saving. Outside his window, the lights of Copper Ridge flickered like stars in the darkness, and somewhere among them, Ayanna Yazzie was preparing for sleep, unaware that her kindness had begun to heal wounds that Thomas had thought would never stop bleeding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Pike would return with more men and deadlier plans. But tonight, for the first time in years, Thomas Brennan fell asleep without checking his gun, without one eye open for trouble. Tonight, he dreamed of hope instead of horror. And somewhere in the desert darkness, change was coming to Copper Ridge. Slow and steady as the turning of seasons, carrying with it the promise of redemption for a man who thought himself beyond saving.